Good day. I'm Chris Jansing, live at MS Now headquarters in New York City, demanding answers. More than 24 members of Congress descend on Minneapolis, outraged over ICE tactics. The latest on the ground and our new reporting about just how often federal agents are firing their guns at cars. Plus, she gave him her Nobel. He gave her a swag bag. Venezuela's opposition leader hands over her Peace Prize to Trump. But is there any sign it will lead to a public promise of support? And is it a plan? The president's long-awaited health care pitch turns out to be a single-page document minus all the details. So what's next for Americans facing soaring premiums? We have a lot to get to on this Friday, but we start in Minnesota, where 24 lawmakers are on a fact-finding mission looking into the fear and trauma caused by the president's immigration crackdown. One after another, local residents recounted stories of being confronted and detained by ICE, despite being American citizens.
I immediately started repeating over and over again, I'm a citizen, I'm a citizen, I'm a citizen. But the agent did not stop to look at my ID. As second ICE agent entered the restaurant, they dragged me outside and put me into a headlock on the ground. I repeated, I'm a citizen, I have an ID. The agent kept saying, that don't matter, that don't matter.
When I was inside my cell, I heard wailing, screaming, crying, begging, and pleading from women, men, and children. Alongside that visceral anguish was the small talk, banter, and laughter from the federal agents outside our cells, clearly desensitized to the deep and audible pain right in front of their eyes.
Those accounts follow a 9th straight night of unrest since the deadly shooting of Renee Good, with law enforcement firing pepper balls and arresting people in the crowd. And as questions mount about DHS tactics, court records reviewed by MS Now reveal that federal immigration agents have fired their guns on cars at least 14 times since last July, justifying them with claims that often fall apart once they're under scrutiny. MS Now's Nnamdi Egawonwu is on the ground for us in St. Paul, Minnesota. David Noriega has been digging into those ICE records. And MS Now national security analyst Chris O'Leary is a former FBI senior executive and senior vice president at the Soufan Group. Good to talk to all of you. Nnamdi, tell us about this field hearing today and how lawmakers are trying to amplify these stories.
Yeah, Chris, the roughly 28 or so lawmakers that attended this hearing say they're doing so to address both the conduct of these ICE agents, some of whom have been accused of violating the constitutional rights of Americans and acts like racial profiling, as well as to shine a spotlight on some of the specific witness accounts you've been hearing regarding that conduct. So you mentioned, we heard from a first-generation Ethiopian refugee, who discussed the fact that he disclosed he was a citizen but was still detained for hours by ICE agents. We heard from another ICE observer who brought up the fact that she was detained for just merely following ICE agents, and during that detention was pepper sprayed, was, in her words, demeaned and taunted, and ultimately forced in a facility for hours before she was ultimately released. A big part of this also, though, is to highlight the community implications of the surge of personnel here, which includes a chilling effect that has led to a decrease in business, with employees, some fearful of going into work, and raids at at least near high schools, including one we saw last week in the hours after Renee Good's death at Roosevelt High School in Minneapolis. I want to play for you an accounting from an ACLU attorney about exactly how the surge of ICE personnel is impacting the community here.
More than 30% of students were absent from classes this week. Parts of our city are like a ghost town, as the very presence of federal agents make them terrified to go about their daily life, and many immigrant neighbors have not left their homes in days, avoiding basic activities like buying groceries, picking up prescriptions, or going to work.
And Chris, we also are just hearing a new message from the president, who posted on Truth Social a message. He says, in Minnesota, the troublemakers, agitators, and insurrectionists are in many cases highly paid professionals. The governor and mayor don't know what to do. They have totally lost control and are currently being rendered useless. If and when I am forced to act, it will be solved quickly and effectively. That at least appears to be another message from the president, who has threatened, or at least or toyed with the idea of invoking the Insurrection Act. That is something that local leaders here have been fearful of and have warned protesters to remain peaceful in order to avoid.
Namdi, thank you so much for that. So, Chris, the administration has warned repeatedly, if you don't want to be detained or pepper sprayed, don't interfere with ICE. But there are all these stories about people who are doing no such thing. The New York Times tells one story of a family of 6. So they're trying to drive home from a basketball game, and they turn onto a road that turns out to be blocked by a protest. And then, quote, crowd-controlled grenades went off around them, and one tear gas canister rolled beneath the car, according to the mother. A concussive blast from the tear gas canister or another device, she wasn't sure, rocked the vehicle, she said, setting off the airbags and trapping the family as acrid smoke billowed around. The couple said they were able to get their children, ages 6 months through 11 years, out of the car only after her husband kicked the door open. A woman, blinded and unable to breathe, circled the vehicle, pulling out as many of her children as she could. They say ICE threw the grenades and deployed tear gas. Now, we can't confirm that, Chris, but what does it tell you about tactics here and the risk for bystanders?
Yeah, it's very concerning, and I think, unfortunately, it's probably going to escalate based on the president's most recent posts here. I think the conditions were set quite some time ago, going back to the rhetoric that the president started in his first campaign and then his first administration and his continued throughout MAGA world and into the second administration. This rhetoric, this labeling of others, this demonization of others, immigrants, the left, calling people terrorists, anybody who speaks out against them or protests is somehow a terrorist. I think that, coupled with everything's a crisis. So, these hordes of invaders coming across the border, Antifa and the far left. Now there's a fraud crisis in Minnesota, so it demands action. And those two things, coupled with the empowerment of DHS and their militarization, this massive budget that they have, and ERO agents and ICE agents and Border Patrol showing up in military gear in a U.S. city. I mean, what they're wearing, although it's not exactly uniform, but those are the same things that I wore in Fallujah, Iraq, or in Afghanistan. Not really appropriate for a U.S. city. And I think those things combined really highlight that this is kind of the Stanford prison guard experiment at scale gone wrong. ICE and broader DHS have now identified themselves as a hammer, and if you do that, everything looks like a nail. So they are escalating in situations that any other federal law enforcement agent or well-trained police officer would not do that. So this is going to continue to just spin out of control unless there's some kind of intervention. And clearly the president and DHS secretary telling them that they have absolute immunity and continuing to label the others is going to be problematic moving forward.
So, David, tell me what you found when you looked into shootings involving immigration officials, not just in Minnesota, but all across the country.
Yeah, nationwide, Chris, since July, we've seen at least 14 incidents in which federal immigration officers, either with ICE or the Border Patrol, have fired their weapons at people in cars. The point here, Chris, is that what happened in the killing of Renee Good fits a very clear, overwhelmingly clear pattern. And that pattern applies not only to the details of the incidents themselves, the shootings, what happens in the field, but also applies to what happens after in terms of how DHS and other federal government agencies handle the case. I want to focus on that second part for the purpose of this conversation, because what happened in the Renee Good case is what has happened in every single one of these other incidents, which is that DHS very quickly makes public claims accusing the people who were shot at of weaponizing their vehicle, attempting to drive their car at federal agents or their vehicles to strike them, ram them, run them over, etc. But in most of these cases, Chris, those claims fall apart under scrutiny. Assaulting a federal officer is a very serious offense. And in only 4 of these cases have there been criminal charges against the people involved that actually stuck and led to ongoing criminal proceedings. In 4 other cases, those charges were either dismissed by a judge or proactively dropped by the DOJ for lack of evidence. In other cases, people were put directly into deportation proceedings without being criminally charged, even though DHS publicly claimed that they had committed this serious offense. And in 2 of the cases, I should mention, Chris, there were no criminal proceedings because the shooting was fatal. That's the killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis, of course, and the other is a case in the Chicago area, the death of Silverio Villegas Gonzalez. Now, Chris, I did hear from DHS on this. They told me that the pattern is not the use of deadly force by law enforcement, but rather the pattern is more civilians using their cars to try and run over agents. But when I asked them about specific cases, they just recycled the same statements that they made in the first place when those incidents first happened, accusing people of weaponizing their vehicles, even though in many cases that claim was directly contravened by video evidence. That includes, for example, the case of Carlitos Ricardo Parias here in LA. There's body cam footage that I hope we can play for our viewers at least briefly. As you can see here, the Border Patrol agent reaches into the vehicle, switches his gun hand to his left hand, and shortly after fires the weapon. He then exclaims, seemingly in surprise, and as you can see from this body cam video, the car is not moving when this happens, nor are there any federal agents in front of the vehicle. Nevertheless, DHS said at the time and maintains to this day that this person tried to weaponize his vehicle against agents. Last thing, real quick, Chris, this is one of the cases that was dismissed by a judge for mishandling of evidence and violations, according to the judge, of the subject's due process rights, including the fact that that body cam video you just watched wasn't turned over by the government until almost 6 weeks after the incident, which was 5 days after the discovery deadline set by the court, Chris.
Wow, some great reporting there. So, Chris, I want to underscore another key part of David's story. According to MS Now, none of the federal agents who fired their weapons have been charged with a crime. And defense attorneys in the cases told MS Now they don't know of any agents being placed on administrative leave or subjected to internal discipline. What message does that send to other ICE agents in the field?
Well, it certainly lets them know that they have absolute immunity. And listen, it's not typical. I'll give you like a personal example. You know, when there's a shooting in the FBI during my time in the FBI, what happens is a team of dozens of agents immediately fly out to wherever that was and conduct sometimes up to a week-long investigation with a team of people. One that I'll highlight is there was a young woman abducted and she was held hostage, and the hostage rescue team rescued her after being shot at by the abductor, rescued her, killed the individual who had abducted her. It was all caught on video, but we still sent the team out and did a thorough investigation, looked into his background, his service record, his psychological state, what his actions were the day before, talked to all of his teammates, and of course it came out as an above-board shooting. But all of that was gone through because that is the standard, and you want to release that information to the public that, you know, this was done right and that we ensured it was done right. And there are still lessons to be learned, because even in a good shooting, there are things to be learned, things that could be done better. None of that is happening now. It's actually going in the wrong direction. And you see these agents, not only in the incident in Minneapolis, the agent had a gun in one hand and a cell phone in the other. I can't think of a situation ever that I would do that. And in this most recent video, he's switching hands to his offhand, which is not his dominant shooting hand. Unless he's a prolific ambidextrous shooter, you would never do that. And it's just a level of training and maturity that is just lacking right now.
Christopher O'Leary and David Noriega, thank you both so much. Meantime, the Washington Post reports today that a man who died while in ICE custody in Texas earlier this month was likely the victim of a homicide. Now, we should note that the company that runs the detention facility did not respond to the Post, and that the paper's reporting has not been confirmed by MS Now. I'm joined right now by Doug McMillon, the Washington Post reporter who got that exclusive. So, Doug, you reviewed an internal ICE document about the death of 55-year-old Geraldo Lunas Campos. As I read it, both sides agree there was a struggle, but then the stories wildly diverge. What did you find out, including the coroner's conclusion?
Yeah, this death was first reported by ICE 1 week ago, at which point they said really nothing about the cause of death. They said that the staff observed him in distress and said that an investigation was underway. My sources internally said that there was some indication of a use of force, so I followed that lead. I found out from a witness, an eyewitness, a fellow detainee at this detention center in Texas, who described a scene in which this man, Geraldo Lunas Campos, was being taken physically into the segregation unit of the detention center. He was insisting on having his medication. He was claiming that he didn't have his medication, and he didn't want to go into the segregation unit without his medication, and that this witness says that they were forcing him to kind of go into that cell. In that ensuing struggle, this witness said that at least 5 guards were essentially choking him, and that they eventually choked him to death. Following that, I learned from the man's family that they'd been in touch with the medical examiner who's reviewing the body, who found evidence of a homicide, and that medical examiner told the family in a call that was recorded, and I have the recording, that this man, they believe that the manner of death was homicide, and the preliminary cause of death was asphyxia due to neck and chest compression.
Now, court records do show Mr. Campos had a criminal record, but what more do we know about him and about security? In other words, how folks with a record, because Tom Homan just said 70% of the people that we hold have a criminal record, how they are detained, and is it different from somebody who's picked up, for example, for coming into the country illegally but has no record?
Well, first of all, somebody with a criminal record certainly does not deserve to be killed. And they also, ICE detention, you can read on ICE's own website, says that ICE detention is not meant to be punitive. It's merely a place to hold people while their immigration cases are being adjudicated. What we've seen in Texas, and specifically this facility, which is on the Mexican border, in which the Trump administration created basically in the span of 6 months from what was an empty patch of desert on the Mexican border. It's a series of large white tents, and it's now the largest ICE detention center in the country. There are very, very frequent and very consistent reports over the last few months of very questionable substandard conditions there. ICE's own inspectors have gone to this facility and found the health conditions, overcrowding. People are not getting recreation time. People are not getting the medical treatment that's adequate for their health. So there are very strong concerns around this specific facility, and I mean the role it's playing kind of currently in the administration's crackdown on immigrants.
Yeah, I mean, in that regard, if he was indeed on medication and was simply asking for his medication, that fits with what you say about this particular facility and people not getting the medical help that they need. But the DHS, as I understand, told you there's an investigation happening. But I wonder, is this an isolated incident? What is the situation overall with ICE deaths in custody?
Well, they are accelerating. Last year, there were more than 30 ICE deaths in custody, which is the highest in at least 2 decades. And over the past 2 months, there's been an acceleration. There were just 4 and possibly 5 in the first 2 weeks of this year. So I think that there are growing numbers of people in these detention centers, but there are also growing number of deaths. And I think that you have to, at some point, start to look at what is causing these deaths, what is the reason for these deaths, and can they be avoided? In this situation, there's definitely going to be a lot of questions about, if this was a homicide, then there's definitely going to be very serious indication that could have been avoided, and there's going to be questions about the training, the oversight of the staff at this facility. But overall, looking at the ICE detention system, I think we really need to start asking a question of, if these deaths are increasing, if we're going to see, 2 a week, 3 a week, 1 a day at some point, potentially, maybe, is this going to be a crisis of people who are not able to get kind of adequate living conditions and medical treatment inside these centers?
Yeah, what really struck me about your great reporting and great writing was that he was reportedly, this victim, said to be disruptive, and he ended up dead. Thank you so much, Doug McMillon, for your great reporting. And people who want to read the full story can do so at WashingtonPost.com. Thank you. In 90 seconds, the 2-word slogan that has the Democratic Party split in 2. We'll tell you what it is. Keep it right here. Today, there's a growing debate about the slogan that's become a rallying cry for some critics of the president's immigration crackdown. As the New York Times puts it, some Democrats fear the phrase abolish ICE will age as poorly as defund the police did. And multiple moderate Democratic think tanks are pleading with the party to avoid that phrase. A memo by the Searchlight Institute warns it's setting a trap. And a memo by Third Way urges Democrats to abolish ICE abuses, not ICE. But that caution is being rejected by other Democrats who think the party should take a more forceful approach against the administration's tactics. Joining me now, Michael Hardaway, former communications director and spokesman for Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, and former Republican congressman from Pennsylvania, Charlie Dent. Okay, Michael, you're a comms expert. As we approach the midterms, is the abolish ICE message potentially going to be seen as extreme, or do Democrats need to embrace it, take a strong stand?
Abolish ICE is not defund the police. If you look at public sentiment, a plurality of Americans want to actually abolish ICE. That wasn't the case with defund the police. I'd also say to you that from a framework perspective, you have to have immigration forces like ICE that are finding people who are here illegally and deporting them. But the group that we currently have is not the group that we need. Many of these people are undertrained. Some of them reportedly are from white supremacist groups. And many of them are just breaking the law with impunity. You can't have that where you have people that are not trained walking around American cities, vandalizing them and assaulting American citizens. That's not what you need. I don't think you can fix that. I think you have to dismantle it and rebuild it properly. I don't see a place where these people train for 47 days and then they're sent into American cities with guns and the power of life and death over all of us, and we expect them to perform the way we need. One last thing I'd say is that there's a reason Donald Trump has sent these ill-trained people into American cities with videographers. I think Donald Trump wants us to focus on these issues and these day-to-day horrors that ICE is forcing upon us, and not this horrific economy that he is overseeing, where 7 million people plus are unemployed, and nearly 2/3 of Americans see the economy as a failure and place that blame on him. He doesn't want us talking about that. He doesn't want us talking about millions of Americans losing health care. And so that is why I think he has sent these untrained ICE officers into American cities with videographers.
So, Congressman, here's how Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez framed funding for ICE just this week.
Just so everybody knows, I want everybody to understand the cuts to your health care are what's paying for this. Understand how these dots connect. You get screwed over to pay a bunch of thugs in the street that are shooting mothers in the face.
So she and other progressive Democratic women leading the charge on the abolition of ICE get a lot of headlines, but do you think that they have a point, or are they handing ammunition to Republicans?
Well, I'd say probably the latter, handing ammunition to Republicans. That's not how it really works, actually. That if you're funding ICE, you're not funding health care. It's as an appropriator, no, that's not how this system works. That said, look, I think the Democrats would be handing the Republicans an enormous gift if they continue down this road of abolish ICE. You may remember 30 years ago, there were Republicans talking about abolishing the IRS. Totally dumb idea. Even if you did that, you would have to create some other tax enforcement mechanism. Just as if you were to abolish ICE, you'd have to create some organization to enforce our nation's immigration laws. The issue is, how do we make sure that ICE performs better? They're not performing up to the standard that Americans expect. It's how they are going about enforcement, whom they are targeting, and why aren't they doing a better job of de-escalating tense situations? But we actually do need interior enforcement of our immigration laws. And frankly, many of these sanctuary cities and sanctuary communities, which are not all the same, they're not all created equally, but they are part of the problem too, because they make it much more difficult for the federal government to cooperate or to work with state and local law enforcement. Last I checked, the federal government does not have a police department. So they do rely on state and local law enforcement. So to the extent that those local communities are resisting or pushing back against ICE, that isn't helpful either. Now, again, that doesn't excuse some of ICE's conduct, but we have to better train and better reform ICE, not abolish it.
So that's policy, which is one part of the equation, right? The other part is messaging. And Michael, California Governor Gavin Newsom was confronted on his own podcast by conservative Ben Shapiro about the response to the ICE shooting of Renee Good and these calls to abolish ICE. Take a listen.
Your press office tweeted out that it was state-sponsored terrorism, which, I mean, Governor, I do have to ask you about that. That sort of thing makes our politics worse.
Yeah.
I mean, it does.
Yeah.
I mean, our ICE officers obviously are not terrorists.
Yeah.
A tragic situation is not state-sponsored terrorism.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So when AOC said this week that ICE should be abolished, you disagree?
Oh, I disagree when I think a candidate for president by the name of Harris said that in the last campaign. I came out, I remember being on Chris Hayes hours later saying, I think that's a mistake. So absolutely.
But does this speak, Michael, to the difficulty of this issue and maybe some of the problems candidates might have in assessing how to approach their messaging?
No, Democrats have to stop backing down. What Shapiro said is nonsense. That is clearly terrorism, where you go into an American city, you have an unarmed American citizen trying to get away from the situation, and you shoot her in the face multiple times. That is terrorism. And so what Democrats have to do is be honest about the situation. I'm not saying that we don't need to figure out some way to better characterize our position here and sort of what this means for us, but we can't back down and let people like Ben Shapiro gaslight us into thinking things aren't what our eyes tell us that they are. There's video of that situation. There are multiple others around the country as well of mothers, of daughters and sons and fathers being dragged out of their homes, some of them American citizens. That is called terrorism. And so we have to be honest about that particular part. But I do think, again, we need some sort of immigration enforcement that ICE does. You have to have that, but you need to dismantle that and rebuild it. I think the best way to do that is pass comprehensive immigration reform so that we all have frameworks in terms of how this works. The idea of sending ICE into American cities with no plan is like putting the cart before the horse, and that is the biggest problem. You don't want these people learning on the job. This is not Wendy's. You can't go into an American city with a gun and let these people figure it out on the spot, but that seems to be what's happening.
We have been talking about comprehensive immigration reform for decades. We should have a serious, fulsome conversation about the possibility of that happening, particularly in this political environment. But it's an excellent point. Michael Hardaway, always great to see you. Congressman, you're going to stay with me. Still ahead, Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado's 18-karat gold effort to win over President Trump. But will it work? There is disbelief in Oslo today over the news that Nobel Peace Prize laureate Maria Corina Machado gave her medal to President Trump. The White House posted this picture of the Venezuelan opposition leader presenting Trump her Peace Prize in the Oval Office yesterday as she fights to win his political support. In return, he gave her a gift bag that featured his signature on the side. MS Now's Jake Traylor is at the White House. Jake, any indication today that the meeting at the White House moved the ball forward for Machado?
Yeah, Chris, I mean, Machado certainly hopes so, but realistically and more likely contextually speaking, probably not. And part of that is because it wasn't necessarily that Machado, the Venezuelan opposition leader, and President Trump had a contentious or bad relationship per se. Remember that Machado for months and for years has really praised the president, aligned herself with his MAGA agenda. Whenever she was first announced as receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, she essentially said that she was dedicating it to the president in the first place. And so she's been really consistent with her praise that she's shared for the president. I think what's really notable and worth paying attention to as well is the president's active relationship with the interim president right now, Rodriguez. There's been some really interesting reporting over the past couple of days that's kind of illuminated how the White House thinks about going forward in Venezuela. And they really view Rodriguez actually as their best option to capitalize going forward on the U.S. oil assets that are potentially there for consumption for the United States economy. And so that continues to be the focus here. Of course, Machado going into this meeting was likely hoping to change the president's mind here and convince him that her opposition party is the way forward for Venezuela. She just wrapped a press conference moments ago and continued to have some of that optimism that she would be elected in the future when Venezuela holds elections. Take a brief listen to that.
I'm just one member of a huge movement of millions of Venezuelans that have decided and are committed to be free. And I have no doubt that President Trump, his administration, and the people of the United States support democracy, justice, freedom, and the mandate of the people of Venezuela. I have absolutely no doubt.
And a couple things worth noting, Chris. It reported that earlier today at some point in time that the CIA director Trump's CIA director met in Caracas with Rodriguez, continuing to show some of that alignment and support for her government there. And also, too, on the subject of the Nobel Peace Prize that was gifted to President Trump yesterday from Machado, it was from the Nobel Peace Prize Committee that they clarified that the physical medal can be given from Machado to Trump, but that the recipient itself remains Machado, despite whether the president himself sees it as him actually receiving the prize. That still belongs to Machado, Chris.
Jake Traylor, thank you. Today, a diplomatic and military show of force for Greenland as the Trump administration refuses to back down from its demands to acquire it. Troops representing Europe's most powerful countries have arrived on the island for joint drills, a not-so-subtle display directed at President Trump, who insists that the U.S. needs the Danish territory for national security reasons. Meantime, a bipartisan group of U.S. lawmakers who disagree with Trump are meeting with officials in Denmark, trying to preserve a close alliance. MS Now's Ines de la Cutada is reporting from Nuuk, Greenland. She joins us now. Ines, give us the latest on what's happening today.
Yeah, Chris, so additional key meetings happening today, this time in Copenhagen. A bipartisan delegation of U.S. lawmakers traveling to Copenhagen to meet with Danish and Greenlandic officials led by Senator Chris Coons. But we know that Murkowski, Tillis and Shaheen are also joining. We understand the point of that meeting is for U.S. lawmakers to reassure Denmark that it is still a key part of NATO and to remind the Europeans that Congress is there and will, in theory, have a say when it comes to whatever the U.S. decides to do next. But we heard President Trump just moments ago reiterating his argument that he needs Greenland for national security reasons, and now, Chris, threatening to impose tariffs on countries that do not support his plans to control Greenland. And meanwhile, here in Greenland, we have been seeing a military buildup as Denmark and its European allies ramp up their military presence. We were at the airport here in Nuuk last night to watch a Danish C-130 land. There was also a group of Greenlanders that had gathered there to watch the plane's arrival. I'll let you listen to their reaction to the military buildup they're seeing in their country.
It's scary, but it's also nice to have allies in arriving Greenland. This is what he wants us to do, to show them that we have more military people here. And well, now he's talking about it's not only for the security, he just wants the country.
It's totally crazy, I think. That we have to have forces in Greenland. Scary because we are living in a world where we can't expect anything, but also it's nice to have the allies who's protecting the people.
So, Chris, they say that for the most part, they find it reassuring. They are grateful that the Europeans are sending in reinforcements. And tomorrow they will be making their voices heard at two big demonstrations that are planned, one outside the U.S. Embassy in Copenhagen, the other outside the U.S. consulate here in Nuuk. Chris.
Ines de la Cutada, thank you. And coming up, what led a Reagan-appointed judge to blast President Trump as an authoritarian? In an extraordinary federal court hearing on deportations, a Reagan-appointed judge blasted the president as an authoritarian. He also accused Secretaries Kristi Noem and Marco Rubio of a conspiracy to infringe on the rights of non-citizen students. All this according to the New York Times. MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin joins me now. These were some dramatic comments from the judge. Tell us about the case that prompted this.
So the case that prompted this was brought by groups that represent university scholars or other university professors. And their argument was that the Trump administration had adopted a policy, essentially, of getting rid of, through deportation, non-citizens who were studying in the country or teaching in the country solely because of their pro-Palestinian advocacy. The hearing yesterday was on the remedy for what Judge Young, William Young, the Reagan appointee that you referred to, had already found was a violation on the administration's part. But the tricky part is figuring out, what do we do about that? And he said yesterday that what he is inclined to do is sort of develop a policy where if somebody who is a member of one of these two groups is deported, that immediately gets brought to his attention. And then the authorities, meaning the federal government, has an opportunity to say, we didn't deport this person just because of their speech. There were other reasons that led to their deportation. But the default is going to be, you explain yourself. Otherwise, I'm going to assume it was unjustified and because of their advocacy.
So is this going to happen? Is that what's going to happen for sure?
He has said that he will place a proposed order on the docket early next week. The parties will have an opportunity to look at it and suggest some revisions, et cetera. But by next week, there should be an order on the docket that sets forth this procedure for if and when somebody who is a member of one of these two groups is deported, and they are obviously a non-citizen, how that's going to go in terms of ICE getting an opportunity to justify themselves, with the presumption being the reasons are not good unless they prove otherwise. Chris.
Lisa Rubin, thank you. That is so interesting. Meantime, a massive new study has the potential to change the treatment for some of the world's most complicated and debilitating psychiatric disorders. Scientists found genetic similarities in 14 disorders, ranging from bipolar and schizophrenia to Tourette's and post-traumatic stress. The findings are significant because researchers say they could spare patients the burden of carrying multiple different diagnoses that require an assortment of different pills. According to the American Journal of Psychiatry, half of all people will experience a psychiatric disorder in their lifetime. Up next, President Trump's long-awaited health care plan and the many open questions it leaves. Keep it right here. President Trump's long-awaited health care plan is finally here, except that it isn't really a plan at all. It's just a single page that the White House is touting as a framework for Congress to work with. As the Washington Post puts it, the proposal does not include new ideas to expand health coverage or simplify America's often Byzantine health care system. It also falls far short of Trump's promises to deliver a replacement for the ACA. I want to bring in MS Now White House reporter Akayla Gardner, and former Congressman Charlie Dent is back with us. So, Akayla, walk us through what Trump is calling the Great Health Care Plan.
Chris, the biggest part of this plan is a plan to extend payments directly to Americans to cover their health care cost. But exactly how much they could receive and through what vehicle that money could come, that's totally unclear. It seems the White House is leaving that up to Congress at this point. But there's also proposals to codify or expand executive actions that President Trump has already taken, including the administration's most favored nations policy, which essentially pegs the price of certain prescription drugs to the cheapest price available in other comparable or wealthy nations. It also has a plan to compel insurance companies and providers to prominently display all costs upfront in plain language to consumers. But it is by far a comprehensive health care plan. It is not substantial enough to replace the Affordable Care Act, but President Trump continues to talk about it as a replacement. Take a listen.
You're going to have great health care at a much lower price, which is the two things. We want great health care and we want low price. You're going to have great health care at low price. Now you have terrible health care at a high price. You have horrible, horrible Obamacare health care. I think we can make health care into a Republican issue because the Republicans are going to be close to unanimous on this. It should be unanimous. Maybe we will be unanimous, but it'll be close. But we have a small majority. We probably need a little bit of help from the Democrats. So whatever we can do, we're going to do it.
Yeah, and at that event earlier this morning, President Trump was telling his Republican colleagues in the room to talk to both of their Republican and Democratic colleagues to get this plan across the finish line. But this comes at a time when talks have stalled to extend Affordable Care Act subsidies in Congress. But an administration official says this plan does not close the door on those negotiations. Chris?
Thank you for that, Akayla. So, Congressman, Democratic Rep. Mark Pocan told my colleague Lawrence O'Donnell last night that this all feels a bit oddly familiar, and here's what he said. Why?
Now, remember in middle school when you had that assignment for a couple months, and the night before you put something together and you never read the book? And, that's what Donald Trump tried to do. He didn't quite get there. He has one page, one side only, with a bunch of platitudes, as you showed. And, this guy's had 10 years to come up with a health care plan. Instead, they cut health care for 15 million people.
So given that this plan really isn't as we would know it, or you in Congress would know it as a real plan, what do Republicans in Congress do now? Can they just do nothing?
Well, I think the congressman made a fair point, actually. If the president has a serious health care plan, he should present it to the United States Congress in bill form. And then we can see what it will actually cost, how many people will be covered, and more importantly, how many people will lose coverage. That's what Congress needs to see. The Congressional Budget Office will score this thing. That's what happened in 2017. Congress put together a plan, and north of 20 million people were going to lose coverage, and that's why it all fell apart. And that's the problem right now today, because Republicans passed helped pass the extension of the premium subsidies, the enhanced tax credit subsidies. They just did that a week or so ago. They did it for a reason, because they know they're very vulnerable on this issue, particularly with independent voters. There is a vulnerability here. Even if Republicans pass whatever it is they want to pass, and it became law, it could take a year or two to stand that up. So in the meantime, they know they're going to have to extend these enhanced premium credits. So that's the reality of this. So if the president has a plan, write the bill, send it to Congress. A one-pager doesn't do anything. Just saying that healthcare costs too much, it's going to be beautiful, and everybody's going to be covered, that doesn't work. Those are just slogans. You need to actually have real legislation here that can be chopped on by everybody.
Yeah, we've already seen a significant drop in Americans signing up for the ACA because of rising costs. And my colleagues here at MS Now talked to one single mom, for example, whose daughter had to drop out of college to help them pay for health care. Take a listen.
I'm having to ask my children to help me do things that should only be my responsibility. And that has broken my heart. I think that's the hardest part. Yeah. They should concentrate on going to school, getting good grades, making friends, not paying a bill.
And look, we know she's not alone. The president said, we're just going to send people money so that they can buy health care. Are voters going to be placated by that? They're still waiting for that $2,000 check that was promised.
Is that to me? Is that question to me?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, please.
I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. Look, the problem with the proposal Republicans are advancing, health savings accounts, flexible spending accounts. These are not new ideas. Association health plans, all these things you've heard. These ideas are 20 years old. The problem is that healthcare is not a static issue. It's a dynamic issue. And Republicans just cannot pretend that we can just go back to pre-Obamacare, pre-ACA. We are where we are, and we have to deal with the realities such as they are. So that's why I think it's incumbent that Republicans get serious about extending those subsidies. I think they have to do that and then come up with a plan. If they can come up with one that can make health care better, I'd be all for it. But you can't write a plan, though, that will end up causing millions of Americans to lose their coverage. And they're learning the hard way that, covering people costs money. It's hard to cover everybody and do it for less money. And that's why this is a very difficult issue for everybody, Republicans and Democrats. So time to get serious, folks, on this issue. And, that woman, I think, illustrated, just the challenges that real people are facing. As I said a moment ago, Republicans know that this issue on health care is particularly going to harm them among independent voters, and it will only get worse over time.
Kayla Gardner and former Congressman Charlie Dent, thank you both. And soon, the suspect accused of assassinating Charlie Kirk will appear in court. Why his lawyers are now trying to get a prosecutor disqualified. Stay close. More Chris Jansing reports after this.